committee directly. Once a member has spoken, please remember to ensure to mute your microphone again so the audio remains clear. When members or officers do wish to speak, please use the hands up feature, or alternatively, attract my attention on screen. When I do bring you in, please unmute your mic, say your name, and allow a brief pause while we ensure you're visible on screen. Once you've spoken, please make sure you lower your hand also. If I could also remind members, the purpose of this evening is to scrutinise and not speculate, and there's certainly a good deal to scrutinise this evening. So with that, I'd like to move to the agenda. Before I do, are there any apologies to report?
None reported directly to me, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. If I can move to item number 1, declarations of interest. Can I ask members have any interest to declare relating to any items of business on the agenda? They do so now. There appears to be no declarations of interest. With that then, can I move members' attention to minutes of the last meeting? These can be found on the supplementary agenda, pages 395 to 402. Allow members a moment or two to locate these. I'm mindful some will be using electronic copies, so allow members a moment or two to locate them. Can we consider the minutes of our last meeting held on the 26th of January? Are there any matters arising? In that case, can I approve the minutes? Is that agreed? Agreed. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of nods to the head, so I will take that. Agreed. Thanks, Councillor Banks. Okay, item number 3. We have 3 reports to consider relating to 2020-21. I suggest we take these in the order that they are published in the agenda, so I'll set these out briefly. Item number 3A, Revenue and Monitor and Budget Update Month 9, pertains or relates to December 2020. B, the Capital Programme Monitor and Budget Update for Month 9, again December 2020. And 3C, the Estimated Collection Fund Outturn Report for 2020-21. With that, can I invite the acting mayor to comment and introduce the report? Councillor Simon.
Thanks, Chair. This report sets out the revenue forecast as at month 9, which is December 2020 of the current financial year, and identifies ongoing management actions to ensure that the year-end position will result in a balanced budget.
Thanks, Councillor Shannon. Does the Director of Finance and Resources have any comments to make on the report?
Thanks, Chair. The report sets out a projected underspend of 163k, which is an improvement from the month 8 position of 813,000. Any underspend that there is at the year end will be set aside and used in next financial year to support response and recovery work on the pandemic. The report also introduces a new section with an additional recommendation that notes the position of the council's companies. So that is an addition to previous reports. Thank you, Chair.
I add a very welcome. I think that's will be welcomed by all members of the committee. Councillor Makinson, I think you're indicating.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I have a couple of sets of questions on the company's report. First, on foundations on page 27. I suppose the big question is, how do you lose £500,000 building just 18 homes when they're not even for social rent? But and that's £28,000 lost on every house. So I suppose you should be grateful that the promised 10,000 homes weren't built, because that would have lost us 280 million. But this is a company that's never been subject to proper financial scrutiny, either here or the company's governance committee. And I think this highlights the big failing that there's been here. My question is really whether the £500,000 shortfall is all this company has cost us, or if not, what would be the total costs if this company was wound up tomorrow? My second set of questions are on ACC Liverpool. Now, the authority has a subvention fund which is used to subsidise big events, including the Labour Party conference. As the centre has been closed for most of the past year, how much of that fund has actually been spent, and where is the rest of that money now? Also, a note from the company accounts that 2 of the senior directors are paid £500,000 each, which is even more than Mr. Reeves gets. As no events are being held or could even be planned over the past year, has the opportunity been taken to furlough them and any other staff? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Makinson. I'm not sure how helpful allusions to salaries are for individuals, so I'd like to refrain from that going forward. I think it smacks of poor form, frankly, and actually doesn't do yourself any favours because it actually draws attention to that and actually the questions that you are asking. If I can ask the Director of Finance to comment, please.
Thank you, Chair. Taking those questions in turn, Foundation's position is a cash position. It is not an income and expenditure position, and relates to back to the ongoing salaries of the staff within Foundations. You will know that the staffing has been reduced within that company going forward now. But we will bring a full Outturn position around that company with the Council's own Outturn report at the end of the year. And on ACC Liverpool, some of the staff have been furloughed in there, and the subvention does relate back to the individual events that are being proposed. So what we set out in this report is the support we as a council have given them to reach the future the trading position that is set out in the report.
Thank you, Councillor Makinson. Does that help? You're still indicating, I don't know if that's from earlier. Over to you, Councillor Makinson.
As long as we do eventually see all of those figures, then I'm happy to leave it there for the moment.
Thanks, Councillor Makinson. I think it is a very something that members do want to see, so I appreciate the inclusion of these figures. I think it's incredibly helpful. One question I have asked, and I'm not sure if members have seen the list of questions that I submitted. I think there's 25 in total. They were circulated prior to the meeting. And I think what might be useful if either Tony or Mel could comment is just to try and get a flavour for the total recovery of costs for those who have been relating to COVID and subsequently submitted to government in terms of what we've claimed, what percentage of those are actually eligible and what we're getting back. I think it's quite important to trying to get a figure in totality, if that makes sense. So if Mel or Tony could comment, that would be, I think, really helpful for members.
I'll take that one. And if you don't mind, Chair, I'll also invite Peter Casterton to speak on this, because it's his team that do those returns, so he will have more detail than me, more of the fine detail than I do. So we get set amounts of money through each time the government make an announcement, which we do a return on to show where those have been spent. We also get to recover the 75% of the income that we have lost on fees and charges, and so far we've been quite successful on both those returns. So do you wish to comment further?
Yeah, the total COVID cost so far is 90 million. We've had additional funding from governments. There's a small net cost of about 3 million, but it's fluctuating during the year. So until we do we will report the final position at the year end at Outturn. But at the moment, the government has funded the vast proportion of the total of that 90 million. Some of it relates to collection fund as well, which complicates it.
Thanks, Peter. I think that's quite useful. I think one thing that probably is worth stating, and perhaps you could give us a little flavour of that, I'm assuming if these are being completed on a regular basis, it's quite a time-consuming and difficult exercise. I mean, technically, are they challenging form to complete, Peter?
Yes, we've done 10. There's one due in on Friday. there's another claim. So we've done 10 claims to MHCLG. So yeah, they're very detailed. You know, they set out all the areas of spend, you know, social care, collection fund, children's services, you know, PPE. So yeah, they are very detailed returns and take some time to complete.
Thanks, Peter. I think Councillor Banks indicated.
Thanks, Chair. I don't know whether I've come in too early here, because what's going to be our long-term solution for the future? What can we do as a council, as an administrator, to sustain the city? Because looking at the budget, and I think we've done really, really well. But what we need is, because other cities, as you know, have gone into bankruptcy and administration. So how are we going to do? Are we going to go to the government for more money post-COVID? And the other question, the business rates, seeing that the business have been closed for 12 months, how are we going to help with the businesses, especially the small independent businesses, about their rates? Because I've just been to a bid meeting this morning, and already in this city, there's a 40% of bookings up on the hotels. So people do want to come back to this city. So we need to make sure that we sustain, because the bid is, there's a working group with the bid and the combined authority, how we're going to work opening up the city in a safer way. So how are we going to sustain what we're doing post COVID? Now, have I come in too early for that? Thank you, Chair.
Very comfortable, because it does, obviously the nature of your question impacts the revenue monitors as we are now, and that's what we're actually looking at. So I think it's a pertinent question, and probably in some ways a pervasive question that probably covers a number of different items on the agenda. So I'm comfortable, if officers are comfortable, to kind of feel that now. Tony, you indicated.
Yeah, if I could, Chair, Wendy, do you want to come in first? I'll come in after you if you like.
Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly, Christine, we're working really closely with all the business networks across the city in relation to the safe opening of our city again. And I think it's really important that we do emphasise that on the safe opening. Certainly, we don't want to happen what happened last time, where, you know, there was a big rush and then we've gone immediately back into a lockdown, because that yo-yoing between opening up and locking down is very detrimental to the city as a whole. So we're working really, really closely. We do have a recovery plan. Details of that will be coming out in the next couple of weeks. So there's a big recovery plan that's gone in with government, which Tony will probably comment on in more details. But we've actually got a community recovery plan as well, and that's going to highlight 10 points that look at some of those issues that we know have really been highlighted in our communities across this last year. Issues we knew that were there before, but certainly they've really been brought to the fore. So things around digital exclusion, things around loneliness and mental health, domestic abuse, all of those things that we know have been highlighted, as well as the support that we can give, you know, to communities and improving high streets and stuff like that. But all of those issues around fuel and food poverty and measures that we're going to take post-COVID to address them as part of our city plan, as we'd started, you know, prior to the lockdown. So that will tie in. But I think what we've been able to do, and investment in our parks as well, it will see, you know, a big investment in our parks, because obviously we've seen how much they have been used across this period and how important that they've been. So we've been able to, from, you know, as you see the budget going forward, that 2 million going forward, you know, to invest in our parks around the recovery plan as well, because I think sort of that's certainly feedback that we have got from people around that. And again, we want to work really closely with those friends groups in the parks who've, you know, sort of worked for years and years, but certainly the work that they've done in lockdown as well to make sure, you know, our parks, you know, litter picked regularly, you know, as well as, you know, working with our staff, you know, to report issues within the parks as well. So, you know, a big thanks to them. But that recovery plan will be coming out in the next couple of weeks to councillors, so they can have a look at that and the proposals going forward.
Taking Councillor Banks' question, there's a wider kind of theme of the adequacy of business rates as being a kind of sustainable income stream for councils in the future. So it may well be more appropriate to revisit that later in the meeting. Councillor Banks, is that okay?
Yeah, because we've got businesses that are leaving the high street, but we've got new businesses like Flannels and Next Moving that are opening in bigger stores. So yeah, thank you for that, Chair. Thanks, Wendy.
Okay, thanks. Are there any further?
Yeah.
I'm keen to keep them. Sorry, I've got Councillor Kennedy indicating, but Tony's indicated. So I'll go to Tony first, then Malcolm. Tony.
Don't want to labour the point here, but just a couple of things. Councillor Banks asked about the council funding going forward. So obviously there's a budget next week, and government only did a 12-month spending review last year, but they are intending to do a 3-year spending review later on this year, and we'll be making representations, I'm sure, with other local government bodies into that. And at this stage, we have a financial plan that is balanced, but that is not underestimating how tough things are going to get for the council. Just on the business side of things, I think we've been on the front foot as a city and a city region in supporting businesses, and that's been very well received by our businesses, not just in terms of the grant programs that have been in place, both local and national.
Unknown participant is now joining.
They've actually been determined really quickly, so we've got payments into businesses really quickly. And what we've also been doing is raising very clearly with government the concerns about liquidity issues for business as things open up over the next 6 months, because as furlough unwinds, fixed costs are going to increase rapidly when demand and revenue may be patchy, particularly for those businesses in supply chains where business confidence is low and payment terms will be short. So we still think the next period is going to be very challenging for business. And as we have been all the way through, we'll be on the front foot supporting businesses and lobbying government on their behalf. And Chair, just very briefly, if I can, because I didn't get a chance to come in before, the issue of ACCL was raised, the arena, and I do need to declare a non-pecuniary interest as a council-appointed non-exec director. And I think, yeah, I'm the same for Wendy, just for the record.
Thanks for the clarity, and thanks for that quite wide-ranging update, Tony. I'm sure a couple of those things we'll be able to revisit, maybe in specific reference to the budget and actually in the future as well, of course. Councillor Kennedy?
Yeah, my question relates also to business, and the figure that stood out to me in reading through the report was the 119 million reserve for business rate relief. Now, I'm presuming that this has to be so large because of the difficulties businesses are facing during this period. Has it been the worst possible period to be involved in the 100% business rates relief scheme?
I'll come in on that if you don't mind, Chair. Councillor Kennedy is one of the strange quirks of local government accounting. The reason for having to put that reserve aside is the business rate scheme that the government put in comes to the council in the form of a grant. So while the reductions in business rates and the grants that the business have seen are sat in the collection fund, the grant sits in the general fund. So we have to put it aside into a reserve to then pay back to the general fund, to pay back to the collection fund. So it's more of a technicality that reserve's being made because of the quirks of local government accounting.
I think that's clear, Mel. I think in effect, are we saying that there's no detriment to the council on that? It's just money that is being transferred by central government.
Yeah.
Councillor Kennedy, does that answer your question? Okay.
That's fine, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. In that instance, I don't think there are any further questions from members arising on item 3A. Can I move that we note the monitor report? Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Okay, thank you. Okay. With that, can I direct members' attention to item 3B? This is the Capital Programme Monitor 2021, and that can be found on pages 34 to 55. Can I invite the Acting Mayor, Councillor Simon, to comment on that report, please?
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, the report sets out the current position regarding the Council's capital programme, again at month 9, December 2020 of this current financial year. And it's there for people to see and comment on.
Thank you, Councillor Simon. Can I invite Mel Crichton to have any comments, if there's any comments to be made on the report?
Thank you, Chair. The report sets out a reduction in the current year's capital programme of 15.8 million. That's mainly due to rephasing of regeneration schemes. It also, this time, includes the inclusion of next steps move on accommodation, which relates to homelessness, which was a previously agreed cabinet report. Thank you, Chair.
Are there any, thank you, Mel, I should say, are there any questions from members? I cannot see any questions arising or any questions forthcoming. If I may, one question I do have. Page 37 refers to the withdrawal of the diagnostic centre as a potential tenant at, I'll just finish this, Councillor O'Brien, I've just seen you indicate there, my apologies. Page 37 refers to the withdrawal of the diagnostic centre as a potential tenant at Paddington Village. I mean, given the wider context and, you know, economic uncertainty, is there a concern that kind of withdrawal of potential tenants might be indicative of wider trends? Does it raise concerns over occupancy levels of the development and therefore return? Tony, Wendy?
Do you want me to pick it up?
Yeah, go on, yeah.
Chair, what we can say in the Knowledge Quarter, if you take Liverpool Science Parks, for example, 95% occupancy with demand for tenants for lab space, etc. Clearly, there's been a slowdown in lettings whilst businesses have been pausing to see what happens with the recession as a result of the COVID crisis. But we think underlying demand is still buoyant. And on this particular plot, whilst Rutherford Diagnostics, it wasn't linked to the COVID crisis, it was linked to some commercial deals that didn't happen for the company. I won't go into any detail about that they withdrew from this. We have been able to enter into discussions with a health organisation to take the whole of the space with a new office building, and those negotiations are at a really advanced stage, and we're very confident will crystallise in the near future. So, of course, the environment in terms of business occupancy has been challenging, but we think the underlying demand for the city, particularly the key parts of the Central Business District and Paddington Village, are really strong, and they will come back strongly in the coming months.
What gives you that confidence?
What gives you that confidence? All the conversations we're having with agents, with potential occupiers, and the growing presence of the Knowledge Quarter as a globally recognised centre for health innovation and life sciences as well.
And research.
Yeah, and the research that underpins that. And you know, there are things going on in the background which I can't talk about today, that are, you know, potentially you'll hear about in the next few weeks, that are really, really encouraging in that regard.
Look forward to hearing about them, and it's good to see that optimism and buoyancy. It's really welcome. Councillor O'Brien?
And please don't apologise, because it took me a while to make that virtual hand raise. That's why I put my real hand up. That homelessness issue, obviously you've probably heard that there will be something probably coming before planning, but I gathered from reading the finance that maybe we'd saved a bit of money, unless I misinterpreted what I read, by closing Labray House. But of course, I've also understood from all the other literature I've read, especially from Paul Brandt's committee, that we have actually housed successfully an awful lot of homeless people. I think it's somewhere over 500. So I'm just wondering, how does this come out overall budgetary wise? We might have had to not house people in Labour, but presumably we've had to take the cost of finding other accommodation for the homeless. So overall, is the bill bigger or smaller? Do we know?
If you don't mind, Councillor O'Brien, we'll come back with some more definitive figures, but some of the costs that we have incurred in moving people and housing people, we've been able to offset against government grants that have come in for just that purpose. So, but we can get you a note that sets out all those costs, because we'll need to speak to the Director of Adults on that.
Yeah. I understand, Mel, because of course it really comes under other committees, but we are a big umbrella committee, aren't we, about money? So I would be grateful if you would email something across, please. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Councillor O'Brien, for raising that important issue. With that, can I move that we note and endorse the report? Oh, sorry, Councillor Jennings, did you indicate late as well? I hope I wasn't ignoring you.
No, I did leave it late. I apologise. I was just wondering if I could ask, with the sale of the freeholds, I think personally that's quite a good move. I'm just wondering, are we going to essentially sell everything that we have freeholds of to those people living there, or is this just a block for this year?
Thanks, Councillor Jennings. Can I just ask? I'm not sure if it's going to be Mel or Tony response to this, but I believe it's the residential freehold that you're referring to, Councillor Jennings. We just have a little bit of context for that first for perhaps members of the public viewing.
Yes, Chair, you're absolutely right. It is the residential freeholds. So this is where people pay us ground rents, or in some cases don't, because it is just a nominal sum that they are paying. But because of legislation coming forward and the way ground rents work, it means if people may want to put new windows in the property, they need to come and ask us as the freeholder our permission. So what we want to do is sell these freeholds to individual property owners, and it is the property owners. We are not proposing at any stage they get sold to a third party at all. So it will be the property owners, so that then it does enhance the value of their property if they come to sell it on the market after, and it makes it much easier for them to be able to do renovation upgrades to the properties. And in terms of, is it a block? We're looking at all the residential freeholds. The programme is a 3-year programme, so we're looking to do rollouts across the city. So we're dealing with sections or areas at a time.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And expect that there's an obvious revenue upside, but there must be a cost saving as well for the local authority, I'm guessing now.
Yes, there are some fees that will be payable on disposal, but also it means that where we have to raise invoices, obviously there's a cost to raising invoices, roughly about £26 a year per invoice. So if it's rent only for £5, obviously it's not worth our time even raising the invoice, but we do need to do that. So we do end up with the cost saving from not doing that.
Brilliant. Councillor Jennings, you seem to be happy with that? Thank you. Okay, for the third time, I'm just casting my eyes around the various members. I think I'm going to be okay this time. Can I move that we note and endorse the report? Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you, Councillor. Can I direct your attention to item 3C? That's the estimated collection fund outrun. That can be found pages 56 to 65. Can I invite the Director of Finance and Resources to introduce the report and comment, please? No.
Thank you, Chair. As I said previously in answer to Councillor Kennedy's question, this is quite a complex accounting position for us because the government grants that have been given for those rate reliefs sit within the general fund. The report does show the collection fund has an overall deficit of 153.9 million. The council's element of that being 149.6 million. We've received grants to offset that figure to the tune of 128.6 million. And then the government have introduced new legislation which allows us to write the loss off over the next 3 years up to 23-24. And we will also receive grants to offset some of those losses next financial year as well. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from members? Okay, hopefully a very brief question from myself. If I can direct members' attention to page 60. There's a comment about the decrease in the council tax base impacting future revenue. Can we just talk around that a little, the decrease in the council tax base? I think it may be in the expectation of perhaps some members in the wider public with, you know, in some areas of the city, housing offer growing and new properties being built, that our council tax base will be increasing. So if we perhaps just talk about that. The exact statement says decreasing council tax base impacting future revenues by 3.5 million. That seems certainly quite material. Is that, are we able to just talk through that now?
Yeah, sure. So the council tax base reflects not only the properties that we have in the city, but also the council tax discounts and the council tax support scheme. So what that figure has reflected, because quite rightly the number of properties increase in the city, albeit slower than we had expected because of the pandemic, that reflects the amount of council tax support that's been given out. So there is a reduction in the council tax base. We've also factored in a 1% reduction in the collection rate as well, to reflect that the collection of some of the council tax debts isn't at the same place it was last year. So we've checked this year. So we've checked this year's collection rates. We've kept a close eye on the whole of the collection fund, in particular council tax, to make sure we have got a reasonable estimate in there for what we expect to collect.
Thank you. Okay. Are there any further questions? Okay, can I move that we note and endorse the report? Is that agreed, members? Okay. If I may, then I'll direct members' attention to the Liverpool City Council budget for financial year 2021-22, and that can be found on agenda pages 66 to 78 and through to 79 to 101. Before considering the budget resolution and reports, can we turn to agenda items 4A, which are the statements of the Chief Financial Officer in respect of the robustness of estimates and adequacy of provisions and reserves for 21-22 associated with the budget. Can I again invite the Director of Finance and Resources, Mel Crichton, to introduce the report and comment, please? Thanks, Mel.
Thanks, Chair. Starting with the statement of robustness of estimates, the report sets out the processes the finance team and I have undertaken to enable me to provide both you and Council with assurance that the estimates are robust. We've reviewed both capital and revenue budgets and the pressures that we've faced in this financial year, both COVID related and outside of response to the pandemic, including the achievement of savings. We've made sure there's plans in place that reflect all of those pressures and savings being addressed, and that we can come to the conclusion at this point in time that the estimates are robust. Would you like me to move straight on to the adequacy of reserves and provisions?
I think so.
Okay. So this report sets out our review of reserves and provisions, which is something we do every year in setting the budget. The general fund balance in particular takes account of the risks that the council is facing, and we look at in detail at the various earmark reserves. The risk the council is facing going into next financial year have increased. That is why we are then recommending an increase of 2.6 million in the general fund balance to 20 million. There is a lot of risk and uncertainty in the system at the moment. You've mentioned some yourselves around the collection fund in particular, but also in response to the pandemic and then the subsequent economic and demand impact that has on the council is still unknown at this stage, hence the reason for the increase in the general fund balance that's being recommended. Thank you, Chair.
Are there any questions arising from members? Councillor O'Brien, did you indicate? Sorry, Councillor Banks.
Mel, just a question, a quick one. On our borrowing at this moment, because of the pandemic and what the issues we've suffered over the last 12 months, and the increased what we've suffered in this council, what's been taken away from us from government, how will it affect us when we have to give that borrowing back? Will the government help us with that borrowing? Will it be wiped clean? Will we have to give a percentage of it back? Do you understand where I'm coming from? Because we've suffered really great cuts in this city over the past 10 years. So, and then we've had to do some borrowing, especially over the COVID crisis. So how are we with the borrowing, and how are we, can we, with the situation where we have to pay that back? Is that a question for this, at this time?
Or under another agenda item? You think it's perhaps more suitable in the budget, or?
I don't mind, Chair. I can take it under here if you like. So we haven't borrowed financially to respond to the pandemic. Government have provided us with grants, and we have kept all the costs in revenue for that. So we haven't borrowed in response to the pandemic. So there is no need for us to pay anything back. The borrowing costs that support the capital programme and any investment are built into the budget every year. So they are reflected in the budget that is in front of you tonight. The way the borrowing is funded, if it is pre the prudential framework, then there is an element of that would have been included in our revenue support grant. We've now transferred that to 100% business rate retention. Anything after the prudential framework that is unsupported borrowing, we need to reflect that in the revenue budget, and that is funded either from invest to save, invest to earn, or if it's important enough to the city, we reflect that in the budget, and then it becomes part of the council's budget gap that we need to address going forward.
Are there any further questions from members? Someone perhaps needs to mute. Shuffling, banging in the background. Can I move that we note and endorse the statements? Is that agreed? Okay, can I direct members' attention to item number 5? And these are the budget recommendations. These can be found on the agendas, page 102 through to 265 and 266 through to 366. I now propose to take agenda items 5A, 6A, and 6B together, with these reports directly relating to the 2000 and 2001 budget setting process. These reports are the City Council General Fund budget and the Capital Investment Strategy 2021. And I invite the acting mayor to introduce the budget proposals for 21-22 and talk us through the detail. I can also confirm that a copy of the resolution of Cabinet in relation to the budgets has been provided to all members of the committee. An email notification of the publication of the minutes of Cabinet sent to all councillors. Councillor San.
Thanks, Chair. Before I start, can I first of all thank Mel and the finance team, and in fact all of our officers right across the City Council, particularly across this last financial year, as well as struggling with the pandemic and different conditions of working at home, and also working quite often in different locations and in different departments to meet the needs of that pandemic, of bringing us a balanced budget that will be proposed to council next week. So I'd really like to express a great deal of gratitude. I know they've been working really, really hard and round the clock to achieve that, particularly as figures have changed, as people have indicated earlier when they've spoken about grants that have come in from government and not being quite sure, you know, sort of what some of those will be in relation to our spend, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic when we were encouraged to spend what we needed, you know, and we would get it fully returned, and that didn't materialise, as we all know. So our proposals do seek, as always, to protect our key frontline services and help the economy recover from the pandemic. And as I said, you know, we will deliver a balanced budget for 2021-22, which will include a commitment to long-term funding for our children's centres, which we know has always been a priority to us since 2010. Additional money to ensure that all rough sleepers are prioritised with the offer of a roof over their head, despite their status in the city, which again is something we've always been proud to do. A start on building council housing at Deptford Road in Newtree. Delighted that that work will begin next month, and we'll begin to see that council house building. And I think it's important to note, I know a full report is coming around foundations as requested earlier, but a lot of the work that foundations did across the city in identifying sites and working with partners has actually done a lot of work to mean that we can progress with some of that council house building going forward in relation to the capital programme. We, as I stated earlier as well, we will have a £2 million recovery fund to support our council's COVID-19 recovery plan, and a £2 million development budget to kickstart schemes linked to that economic recovery, which will be extremely important in the city. We've also got funding earmarked in the capital infrastructure programme to continue with the development of Paddington Village in the Knowledge Quarter, which we know will deliver good quality jobs, along with upgrading key routes across the city, as well as refurbishing the M&S Arena so it can continue to be a leading concert and events venue. We've also set money aside for repairs to our lifestyle centres, and in particular Peter Lloyd, which does need some emergency repairs to reopen post-pandemic. It's got issues in relation to the roof. And we know from speaking to our councillors in East Liverpool, you know, that's one of the few council resources that is actually in that area, and is probably our second most used centre. And we know the importance that our lifestyle gyms have been to people's emotional and mental health, as well as their physical health, and that will become to the fore as well post-pandemic and the recovery that we'll be going through. We've also plans to develop a community bank, a Northwest Community Bank, which was started. I can see Councillor O'Byrne smiling because I know she's been involved as well with some of the partners in that, in partnership with Wirral and Preston. And that first commitment of funding is around the licence for that bank. That will probably take about 18 months. And I know from the pre-work that has been done with the partners, there is a lot of interest from other partners. So as that progresses, probably the cost to the council will significantly reduce going forward. That will not only help to boost our local high streets by having a presence, it will also assist small and medium-sized businesses who struggle at times to get loans. The credit union can't give the type of loans that they require, and sometimes they can't get those loans from the banks, but because of the obviously mutuality of the bank and the ethical way it's managed, that will assist them, as well as for our residents as well, who've struggled at times to get bank accounts to be able to do that. And we also know where mutual banks have been set up, and the community banks, that a lot of the credit unions also choose to bank with that bank as well. So as that progresses, we will go forward. We know that the council has secured 20 million of funding from the government to cover COVID-related costs for the coming financial year, and 7 million as its share of extra national funding for adult social care. Our proposals for one-stop shops following our consultation period has been amended in response to that consultation and in negotiations with the trade unions. There is a commitment to retain 2 full-time services within council buildings, such as libraries or other centres. They're to be determined through a working group going forward in relation to where they should be, but there will also be additional services on a permanent basis in other buildings across the wards in the city. And because of that, the savings option has been reduced from 1.15 million to 768,000. As well as the fixed face-to-face slots at a number of community locations, there will also be some flexible satellite community hubs. We're trying not to use the word pop-ups at the moment because that gives the idea that they will come and go, but there will be regular face-to-face slots in communities right across the city. Again, those locations to be determined by the trade unions and management working group, as well as input from the consultation that councillors were able to put forward organisations or council buildings within their wards. And as I said, the detail on this is still being worked on, and the unions have obviously got to put the final proposals to their staff, but this is going really well. As part of that, there will be no job losses, and there will also be some facility for staff to actually progress, particularly if they choose to go into the Revs and Ben's service, where they can also undertake apprenticeships as well, which is fantastic for them in being able to get some additional training. Council tax, which accounts for just 15%, as people know, of our overall budget, will rise by 4.99%, which will generate an additional 9.1 million, 3% of that being ring-fenced for adult social care. That means that 6 out of 10 homes in the city in Band A will pay an additional £1.10 per week for council services. We will be one of the few council, those right across the country, to continue with our council tax support scheme to help those on low incomes. And on top of that, our citizen support scheme will continue, which will make payments to people in crisis and discretionary housing payments to help people needing emergency support to pay their rent. A total of 15 million of savings will be made through a mixture of cutting the cost of services, reducing demand and increasing income. They include an item we discussed before, the sale of the residential ground rents, 2 million restructuring debt and changes to the management of cash and assets, additional fees and charges for highway services, the reviewed operation as I've gone into over the one-stop shops, managing demand for long-term adult social care packages, reviewing supported accommodation for adults and reshaping home care delivery. Subject to the outcome of discussions tonight, the recommendations and budget proposals are scheduled for debate and determination at next week's Budget Council on the 3rd of March. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Wendy. I think I'll certainly have some of my own questions, but I will go to members first. And just to echo your positive comments about council staff, really good to hear. I'd also say it's certainly lots of work, not just gone into the budget, but the consultation as well. It's clear that, you know, a lot of effort has been done to solicit your opinions and views of communities that we serve, and obviously that's really pleasing. So I think just to echo those comments, which hopefully all elected members should agree with. Councillor O'Brien first.
To welcome what our acting mayor had to say about the one-stop shops and praise consultation that's gone on about that, because certainly in my ward we had a consultation quite early on about the subject. I also welcome the fact they're going to drop the term pop-up, because I think some of our residents maybe thought it was going to be a cardboard counter sometimes outside the library rather than in it or whatever. I've actually been using the term myself, peripatetic, because I remember we had peripatetic music teachers in school and they always came on a regular basis. So you knew they were going to be there that 1 or 2 days a week that they undertook. And that's been my understanding about the one-stop service. It might not be 5 days a week in some of these places, but people, residents, could get used to the idea that they would be there for them still, but at a certain time on a regular basis. But I did want to add that I know Christine might want to come in about this. I know that taxi drivers were particularly concerned that they should have somewhere accessible because so many of them will not be applying for their licenses online. And there is going to continue to be a reducing number of people who will not be doing things online. And that's why it's important to have the one-stop service accessible to people. So thank you, Wendy, for continuing it and managing to make a saving too. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor O'Brien. What I will do very briefly is just offer Christine Banks, Chair of Licensing, the opportunity to come in with a supplement or add to Councillor O'Brien's comments.
No, I have to declare an interest.
Okay, in that instance. Okay.
Anything I say, those taxi drivers will come back with me about it. So leave it at that. Okay.
So we'll leave it at that in that instance. I think it's really positive, and I'd echo Councillor O'Brien's comments. I wonder whether it's maybe in terms of how we present the solution, whether hybrid would be a better term. I don't know. Do you think, would that be fair, Councillor Simon?
I think it would be useful. I think the staff themselves want to sort of, I know we've got a number of initiatives, so it's making sure that people don't get confused with different things. So I think the working group to come up with a name, listening to what the staff have to say is really, really important. I know they were talking about community-based hubs, and I know as part of our inclusive growth plan that went into the city plan, we were also talking about, when we were talking about community-led regeneration, we were talking about community hubs, that sort of thing. So I think sort of, as long as people are aware it's not pop-up, it's going to be there and go away. I think another important thing that we've agreed with the trade unions is that this service will not be reviewed for a further 2 years. We will let this service bed in, and begin to see how, people, because it's going to be in quite a number. Currently, the service is only in 4 wards across the city, and the expansion of that to many more wards is actually going to give people that opportunity to, sort of go into those centres. So I think the name can develop. I think just getting rid of the pop-up is really, really important, because I think that is causing a lot of anxiety for people.
Yeah, the opportunity to put it together for all residents, and I think that is...
Sorry, Anna, couldn't really hear you there.
I think how you kind of conveying that, it's the opportunity for it to work for all residents who aren't necessarily supposed to exist in one-stop shop. And I think, we should see perhaps the upside there, certainly. Councillor Makinson.
Thank you, Chair. The original proposals were just to have one full-time one-stop shop in St John's Shopping Centre. Now, is this proposal to keep an additional 2 shops, or is there going to be just one extra shop outside the city centre? And also, there's a wider concern here where councillors are being asked to vote for a budget which will potentially close their local one-stop shop, but they're not knowing what they're voting for until after they voted for it. I think on the issue of the pop-ups or not pop-ups, there's a very comprehensive list of potential sites here, including even an Aldi car park. Yet I noticed that Allerton and Chilwell libraries are being completely left off the list. Is there anything particular reason for that?
Did you meet with the one-stop shop, Sandra, as part of the consultation?
I didn't get that chance, unfortunately.
Well, every councillor got the chance to meet with them because everybody was sent out an email, and the list of sites there, they're not the definitive sites. They are the sites that local councillors put forward when the one-stop shop staff travelled around the city meeting local councillors. So every councillor was given that opportunity, not just ones who currently have. Some chose libraries in their wards, some chose community centres that they know have a lot of footfall going forward. So certainly, they will look at all permanent council buildings, because one of the things from the staff and the trade union is they wanted to secure council building for those services to be in. So, you know, people recognised that it was somewhere to go in the community. So unfortunately, if you didn't take that opportunity, you or your fellow councillors, to meet with them, that's why they're not on that list, not because it'll totally be discounted. But the sites have not been fully determined yet. So I'm sure if it's felt there's a need around that within those sites, that could be looked at, but that will be the reason why they're not on the list.
Andrew might be keen to know as well as I am. How soon are we likely to see more detail? Is that something that you're interested in as well, Andrew?
It is, but my previous question as well of is this just going to be one additional shop outside of the city centre?
Well, it's not determined where those two permanent ones are yet, but that's what I said at the beginning. There will be two permanent ones that will be open 5 days a week. There will be other sites that will be opened less days a week than 5. And more than the 4 that we've currently got. And then there will be a flexible service on top of that. So there'll be 3 elements. The reason all of the detail isn't there is we're still finalising the details of that. The trade unions have got to put that to their staff. So it would be unfair until that has been agreed by the staff and the trade unions to put all the detail going forward. How that will be implemented will then go in the form of a working group. So certainly, you know, when we get to the stage of council, we'll know in principle if those details have been accepted. Like all, it's a service review. This it's although it's a budget saving, and with all of those, they take a number of months to implement going forward. So that service review and those elements to it will be what will be proposed to council. So the actual details of where they will be right across the city. So certainly more people will benefit than do now from having a one-stop service that they can access in their community.
Okay, Chair, I've also got a question on item 5B. Do you want that now, or do you want me to wait?
I think so. We're taking A and B together, so please do.
Sorry, you're breaking up there.
Sorry, please do, by all means.
Right.
5B, please do.
Okay, thank you. Just on page 294 under leisure, in 2016 we put £4.5 million into the various football hubs, and part of the argument was that it would get us out having to commit future expenditure on these sites. So I'd like to know the reason why we're spending a further £500,000 on these sites now.
In relation to the football hubs?
Yes.
Obviously, this is a national scheme. You're talking about the Park Life scheme
yes.
On that page. Sorry, I haven't got that in front of me. The company who were originally, going forward with that, we are working with Sport England because the company, due to COVID and whatever, went bust, and a new company have come in. So we are working in partnership with them around those sites and some of the facilities that are on that site. So that is the reason there is expenditure there as well, Andrew.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Councillor Corbett, got your hand up. Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of things. Just to the acting mayor, to Councillor Simon, just thank you for the model that you've used in terms of consultation on the one-stop shop, because I think that was really helpful that it went out. And I certainly had a really good meeting with the various officers, and then was able to follow that up. And I think that the fact that there's going to be no job losses as well is an element of it that is really crucial for the economy in the city and for our staff. The equality impact assessment as well. So thank you for picking up on the digital access that is desperately needed by everybody, but not everybody has it. And in terms of the citizen support scheme and the council tax support scheme and the discretionary housing payment, that's great that that's all staying in, because that will help us through the recovery process as we come through. And the pressures on that, we could have easily tried to take that out, but you haven't, and I'm really grateful for that. Just one query on page 122, which is probably for Mel. It's one of the appendices. where it talks about other planning assumptions. It says national living wage fell under that, about 1, 2, 3, 4 down. Do you mean the national living wage, or do you, and the question is, are we still paying the real living wage to our directly employed staff? And I presume the answer is yes, but I'm just looking at the national living wage pressure there on page 122 rather than real living wage.
The answer is yes, Jane.
Thank you, Wendy.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jane. And I think to point that out in terms of we are retaining, and one of the few councils to retain our council tax support scheme. You know, 10 years into austerity, well, over 10 years now, there's no easy decisions and budgets, but to be able to retain that, well, that is a real commitment to the poorest and most vulnerable. And I think, you know, certainly from our perspective, that should be lauded. It's really welcomed, and I think it will make all the difference in our communities. Councillor Jennings.
Thank you, Chair. Mine are also on the capital plan, capital programme. The investment in the airport, I read yesterday, I think Heathrow had lost something like £2 billion, and its passenger numbers were down to 1975 levels. I mean, I imagine when lockdown finally eases, vaccine or no vaccine, I think some people are still going to be very hesitant to be flying, or in fact cruising either. The cruise terminal comes into play as well. So are we sure that we're going to continue to see a return for our investment? I noticed that the loan had been extended, and I was wondering, is that to allow a longer recovery time for airport transport generally, and therefore the return on the investment? Yeah, that really. Thanks.
I don't know if Mel's coming in, if she's down.
Yeah, she is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, we have two different investments in two different companies. We have shareholdings in the airport, and then we have shareholdings in the airport property company. And it is the property company where the loan has been extended, and that is not dependent on passenger numbers, because that relates to property holdings that have tenants in there occupying those buildings, hence for the reason to see fit to extend the loan on there. In terms of the airport itself, we are keeping a close eye on the results of the airport. They're not expected to be very good this year, as you would expect, but we do think and feel that the airport is somewhere that will recover. It's certainly the indication from the carriers from Liverpool John Lennon Airport in particular that they see quite a robust bounce back. But I don't know if Tony may want to comment on that from an economic development perspective.
Yeah, just to support what Mel's saying there, Chair, if I may. Obviously, the Prime Minister's announcement on Monday of the roadmap to come out of lockdown with timescales attached to that has caused a really significant surge in bookings for holidays overseas as well. And it really, the first really clear indication that pent-up demand is still there. And so we do expect the airport, after a very, very difficult period, to start coming back strongly. And just to pick up Councillor Jennings' other point, obviously we sold half of our shares that we held in the airport a short while ago before the pandemic. They were sold pretty much at the very top of the market, where the council got a very, very good return on that. It's going to take a bit longer to get back to that level now because of what's happened with the pandemic and the impact on flying. But we do expect that demand, and the early signs are that those expectations are being met by the response from passengers.
Thanks, Tony. Just at this point, I will note to members that I was appointed to the Liverpool John Lennon Consultative Committee by virtue of the fact that I'm a Speak Garston councillor. So that is just for information purposes. Are there any further questions arising from members? Okay, thank you, Wendy. Can I now thank Wendy, all the officers involved with this. It's incredibly time consuming and difficult in many ways. And also thank members for the quality of the scrutiny. Some excellent questions, I think, and thank you for that. And we will certainly, again, discuss this at full council. Can I move that the budget resolution be endorsed? Is that agreed?
Yeah. If I may abstain on this, please.
Councillor Jennings, would you remember?
Yes, me too.
Our group will likely be submitting an amendment, as always, however small, so I feel that I can't agree that this version goes forward, but sure. I'll abstain at this stage. Thank you.
Likewise, Chair.
Okay. Have you anything further to add at this stage, or?
Not at this stage, Chair, no.
Okay, no problem at all. Thank you very much. Okay, with that, can I direct members' attention to item number 6? That's the COVID-19 pandemic response. Decision-making structures and decisions from March 2020 to February 2021. This is split into 2 components, if you will. It can be found on agenda, pages 367 to 386, and then on supplementary agenda, 403 to 418. And this is basically a chronological split, I think it's fair to say. We will now consider a detailed report on appendices which advises on temporary decision-making structures and frameworks introduced in March 2020 in order to coordinate the City's Council's operational response to the COVID-19 pandemic, together with details of all decisions made under the framework for the period March 2020 to February 2021. Can I invite the Acting Mayor, Councillor Simon, to introduce the report? Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. As indicated by yourself, the report does outline the temporary decision-making structures and frameworks which were introduced to coordinate the City's operational responses to COVID-19, as well as decisions that were made under these arrangements. So the report identifies key decision-making groups and their respective decision-making powers to the extent that decisions are being made and overseen in response to COVID-19. It also explains and outlines the relationship between each of the groups and the relevant reporting mechanisms in place. It provides information on relevant legislative and regulatory requirements associated with the recording and reporting of any decisions made and compliance with relevant transparency provisions. It outlines how the grants regime has operated during COVID-19. 151 million has been awarded to businesses to date, equating to 24,000 payments. Some businesses being eligible for more than one payment during this period. Payments were made very quickly as the urgency was to ensure that those businesses affected received that funding as soon as possible. However, enough grip, we feel, was established by performing as many eligibility checks as possible in advance of the payment being made, ensuring a segregation of duties throughout the process to prevent internal manipulation of payments. Applicants being required to make declarations, ensuring they were aware of their obligation to provide correct information, and individual risk assessments of each grant scheme being made and reviewed. Going forward, we will continue to make prepayment checks on current grant schemes, including companies' house checks and duplicate payment checks, and actively work on our post-payment assurance plans to identify any potential fraudulent or ineligible claims and to recover monies from relevant applicants, including participation in the National Fraud Initiative data matching exercise. Appendix 1 outlines the key decisions which have been published. Appendix 2 and Appendix 3 relate to the operational decisions of the groups identified and outlines what audits are to be conducted over the next 12 months in relation to COVID-19, which includes governance, PPE, finance, children and young people's SEN, and some of logistics we face, such as establishing the food hub.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for that update. Okay, thank you again. Can I invite members for questions and comments, please? Can you indicate by raising your hand virtually, and we will take questions and respond in turn. Councillor Makinson.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions. Firstly, page 414 under D5 on the DBS checks for redeployed staff. Is this just relating to renewals, or were any staff redeployed to sensitive areas without receiving DBS checks? I think we just need that clarified. And on the issue of PPE for support workers, a recent laming visit actually found that social workers were being expected to make daily requisitions for their PPE before each household visit, which the added bureaucracy forced them to go and buy their own PPE rather than making a separate trip each day to collect the equipment. Have those issues been resolved?
Yeah. On that second one, Chair, we'll have to come back on the detail. On the DBS checks, I'm not sure whether Mel is able to answer that. If not, we will come back on that detail to Councillor Makinson and to all of the members of the committee as well.
I should imagine, given the it was in response to COVID, just on knowledge that I have, that they would have been staff who ordinarily don't have direct contact with vulnerable people, but due to the nature of their transferring from one department to another, required that level of either an ordinary DBS check or an enhanced check if they were having direct contact, unaccompanied. So I would assume if people don't have that today, that would be what that cost was for. But as Tony said, we will get back.
I think we
did have a lot of staff who were attached, particularly in food distribution. Also, when we had the hubs in that first lockdown associated with our children's centres, and obviously we still had vulnerable children going into those children's centres when they were acting as a hub at schools rather than providing education at the time. So I should imagine some of that was that, Andrew, but obviously we can get back the full detail of that unless Mel knows that to hand.
Yeah, we had previously some areas of the council used the paper-based DBS system, and because of the pandemic we needed to move to online DBS checks. So part of that delegated report was to agree to that move online. The other element of it was exactly as Wendy stated, that we had staff who needed to move into the priority areas who didn't necessarily have DBS because of the substantive role. And in doing that, there was a system put in place of getting fast-track DBS in and DBS and shadowing of people, and certain controls put in place around people not being left alone. So that's what that delegated authority related to.
Very important issue. Councillor Makinson, does that satisfy the sense of the assurances for it?
I think certainly, as we'll be getting further information, I'm happy to leave that there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Tony, would you like to come in yourself, or Wendy? I'm not sure.
Yeah, it was me, Chair. And just on the payment of business grants, because when you look at the data, it doesn't tell the full story. But if we go back to the start of the lockdown, when government announced these payments, this was just before Easter last year. And in the first 5 days, the guidance changed every day. And because of the extensive business consultation that we were doing at the time, and we've continued all the way through the pandemic, we were aware that a lot of our small businesses, particularly in the hospitality sector, on average were carrying about 15 days cash. In other words, if we didn't get the payments out really quickly, they would run out of cash and those businesses would fold. And Mel's team, Martin Youngnitz and his team, worked over the whole of the Easter weekend and processed something like £35 million worth of business payments over that weekend. As Wendy said, carrying out all reasonable checks within the timescale. But as a result of that work, our staff, to my mind, absolutely saved hundreds of businesses and thousands of jobs in the city. And on top of that, as a result of the work they did, we were able to identify those businesses that didn't quite qualify because the government parameters were pretty tight. and we were able to, working with their Northwest colleagues across local government, but led by our team here, put a dossier together for government to say that these are the businesses that have just missed out, but we don't think that was your intention for them to miss out, and we think you should consider support for these businesses. As a result of that, and I had conversations with ministers about this, they launched a discretionary business grant scheme because of the work our team had done. And in our city alone, but right across the country this applied, they saved dozens more businesses and hundreds more jobs. And I know this is perhaps not the key purpose of the committee, but that's the first chance I've had with members to put on record the absolutely brilliant work our staff did, the great engagement with business and the impact, the very real impact that has had, not just on the businesses, but the thousands of people that work in those sectors in the city. So I just wanted to make that point.
Chair, and just on that as well, I think in looking at this report, this is a whole new decision-making structure that's been set up with our existing resources and existing staff. And just to put that into context, over 2,000 meetings have took place across this year and 400 decisions being made around that. Our staff have worked Saturdays, Sundays, as Tony's just indicated, across holidays, spending time away, from their own families and gone above and beyond. I know we thanked them at the beginning, but I don't think people realise, particularly in that beginning when it was really unclear about PPE, it was really unclear about vulnerable people shielding, about where they get food. Councillors were doing fantastic work in the communities, trying to mop up some of those things, but we had the food hub at the arena, we had the PPE going out, and these things were all having to be responded to really, really quickly. So I just think we can't thank enough our staff for not only being flexible, but actually responding to that need to their community, because, the majority of our staff do live and have friends, relatives, within the community as well. But it was a mammoth task, and they've done absolutely amazing. And I think sort of as well as the report going forward, we really should thank the amount of work that's been done, particularly with people going above and beyond on a daily basis.
Well, I would certainly hope those remarks are echoed by all of the committee, and if that is the case, then if we can have that minuted, our collective gratitude. Certainly from my perspective, it lays bare a couple of things. Firstly, in a very challenging context of cuts, budgets, consultations, COVID redeployments, the efforts that our staff make and the sheer number of unsung heroes, it is really, really something else. And I'm so glad those comments were made. And I think they perhaps allude to a wider point, and I'd be interested in Tony and Wendy's views on this, and that's the importance of local knowledge in a COVID response. Did we see enough of that initially? And going forward, what can we do to make sure that that kind of is the case in a crisis that, we're not out of yet?
Yeah, I think local knowledge is extremely important, and I think that's why, as well as setting up those central hubs, around the PPE, around mental health support, the phone lines and the PPE, actually the work that the councillors were able to do via either our M&F, some of the hardship funds that went out last year, to be able to work with their local community organisations, local faith groups, community leaders, to be able to feed back in sort of people who were slipping through those nets. And I think sort of our whole approach going forward to community-led regeneration is really important around that, about, each of our wards will have very different needs in relation to, the communities that live there. And I think sort of the mass testing pilot probably is one of the biggest things where we could actually respond very, very quickly to local demands. And that's why we've continued to press government in relation to having, that sort of rollout for the vaccination programme going forward, where, certainly we can respond much more quickly and actually target either vulnerable groups or those hard to reach groups by using those community organisations who know really well where those people who maybe, particularly where you've got wards where there's high instances of HMOs or a transient community, who really know their communities well, and who know the organisations that engage with them. So I think we've done loads of mapping work, and again, as Tony said earlier, even when we're looking going forward into some of the benefits we may see as a city, I think our collective efforts through this are seen not just as national exemplars, but international exemplars. We're certainly getting queries from, across the globe on how we've managed the pandemic in our city. And I think each and every one of us, all of the councillors playing a role within their communities, knowing their communities well, as well as those central efforts, have played a big part in our response. And actually, some things, you don't always get right, but sometimes you just have to go for it and see if it works. And certainly we've learned a lot from that, and I think it will really help us with some of that community work going forward post-pandemic.
Thank you. Tony, anything to add? Or?
I think Councillor Simon summed it up. The one thing I would say is that we will in due course be bringing forward proposals to review senior management, and in discussion with Wendy and colleagues, my proposals will focus much more on neighbourhoods and making sure the lessons we've learned through this process are applied, and really bringing to life that key theme running through the city plan of empowering people and communities to take control of their own lives in the places that they live. And I think that will be a theme that we've picked up from this. We've learned a lot. And I think the second point I'd probably make is that to continue the amount of engagement that has gone on through the pandemic, because it gives you an incredible amount of intelligence about what's happening. I gave an example just now of the knowledge we built up about the situation that small businesses were in. Under normal circumstances, we wouldn't have known that. But by that dialogue, really regular dialogue with business groups, we were able to understand what the requirement was and respond accordingly. I think that applies in all sorts of circumstances. So I just echo everything Councillor Simon is saying.
Thank you, Paul. Very powerful words, and perhaps some certainly causes of optimism for the future as well. Councillor Banks.
I don't know what else to say now. I think it's all been said, but at first times being a central ward councillor, where hospitalities we're getting in touch with myself and my colleagues day after day, where we had people who were literally crying on the phone, worried about the business, worried about the staff. And I have to say, I could get in touch with our staff on a Friday night or a Saturday morning and receive a response within a couple of hours. I don't think I've heard the hospitality in this city of patted Liverpool on the back for the way we've responded to their needs and to keep their businesses small, especially the small independent businesses going. And I'm not going to say any more because it's already been said. But again, our Martin Junget staff, Richard, and there's a young lady there, they have been absolutely fantastic. That's all I have to say. Thanks again, Tony, Wendy. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And again, I think that's something a lot of ward councillors would echo. Certainly, Councillor O'Brien.
Thank you, Chair. I feel that because we're supposed to be a scrutiny committee, I shouldn't be dishing out so many bouquets to people, but I feel I must do so because I also thought that was a fantastic initiative when I read about it in the notes, that we diverted money to the hospitality industry, because it used to be on the local news practically on a daily basis. And I now realise why all those complaints suddenly went down. Became aware of it in my own ward, not really so much because I know which council officers to get in touch with. I just got in touch with Gary, the deputy mayor, and a little business that does a lot of stuff with children, and especially autistic children, but on a commercial basis. She was really struggling and thought she'd have to shut. Well, now she's not going to shut. And the other thing I also wanted to bring up is that I thought it was amazing the way we got that money through the mayor, that top up. And once we put that money into our community and our ward, what we found was it had a multiplier effect. That once people realised that something was forthcoming, other people jumped on the back of it. So we had other charities and supermarkets now in the ward that are giving us money, so that we weren't only able to give out the stuff that we immediately gave at the beginning of the pandemic, we've been able to do Christmas hampers. We've just done more hampers, and we've got money in the account now to do something at Easter. So the community's come forward because the council did the right thing to begin with, which I think is great. And the third point, which is more of a question, I know from our Equalities Task Group that the council somehow or another has put £1 million on an ongoing basis into domestic abuse. And I think that's also going to be a really good initiative, because in a separate group that I'm involved with the whole of the Liverpool City region, we found that the whole problem with most of the domestic abuse agencies is that they're always having to reapply for funds every single year. It's terribly time consuming and worrying for them. So that we will now in the city hopefully be able to fund people on an ongoing basis, as long as we're happy they're doing the right work. And this is going to be a great thing, I think, going forward for victims of domestic abuse. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor O'Brien. I'll move to Councillor Corbett if that's okay, but thank you very much for those comments.
Thank you, Chair. Just Tony, the discretionary business grants, that worked really well. So thank you for listening to local businesses. I know in my ward, there were some businesses there that were at the end of their tether, and actually they just missed out for various reasons, and they got the discretionary, and that kept them alive. I think the give credit where it's due to the government. In terms of getting that emergency, the grant for the emergency grants for food and essential supplies. So we got the 0.9 million out of the 67 million, and then we got some further on later on. Okay, yes, they should have been paying for this for a very long time, and we picked it up. But given that they've given it to us, I think having a system in place that we could slot it straight into, and then it gave the wraparound between whether it's the business grants where people were really struggling, but they just about managed to make go, or they didn't, and therefore they were managed to getting emergency grants for food and essential supplies, and linking it up with the food provision and the MNF. So we had an actual tying of all the coordinating, all the bits, so we kept people safe through the whole crisis. We'll obviously have to continue to do that. But I think the key bit, I think, for me was when Tony said we'd listened really carefully to the businesses themselves and the neighbourhoods, so that you get that real discussion at the street level. So we're hitting the target spot on rather than randomly thrown around the city. It's really targeted, and it makes a huge amount of difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I think Councillor O'Brien made an important point. Whilst it's important to recognise good work, we are, here to scrutinise as well. So I don't know to what extent elected members perhaps feel there's an element of some businesses still falling through the cracks. Is that an experience any members have kind of? What do we think on that?
Certainly, from my point of view, we've got a whole host of people, particularly freelancers, and people who don't fall within the government's criteria. And certainly we've tried to work with organisations to look at how we can support some of them going forward based on what their needs are. So I know certainly within the cultural organisations, we've sort of worked with March for the Arts, which is a local organisation who we're looking at, even though there might not be the money there, what could people put together as some sort of directory to support people working with them. And I think that was important, listening to them, what they wanted. There's been a whole issue in relation to taxi drivers. We have, a massive amount of taxi drivers because of our nighttime economy and because of our visitor economy and hospitality sector in the city, obviously that's been hit greatly. You know, some of those are self-employed, others are not. It's just been a whole, and most of them, or a fair number of them, have fallen through the net, and we have looked to support where we can due to the sheer volume of the number of taxi drivers at times. You know, I'm sure, and I know a number of local councillors I've met with the Taxi Drivers Union, you know, to look at, you know, ongoing support. We've certainly made them aware of our citizen support scheme. We've made them aware, because, you know, they weren't fully aware of perhaps things that the council were doing. It might not necessarily be a grant to them, but it would be areas whereby, you know, they may get some support and they might not have been aware of that. What was also difficult in relation to taxi drivers and some other people who were self-employed, particularly people who've then gone on to universal credit, you know, sometimes then actually getting some form of payments may tip them, you know, out of not getting those benefits. So it's a lot more complicated sometimes when people are doing those grants, because of a whole lot of things to take into consideration. So I think, you know, we do know there are people that have slipped through the net. And even with things that went well, I think lessons to be learned going forward. You know, there were lots and lots of schemes across lots of wards and with the City Council as well around food, either food distribution, you know, food banks, you know, preparing meals, particularly in that first provision, that people learned lessons and adapted going forward around that. But I think, you know, that food poverty and stuff is work, you know, certainly in our recovery plan, we look to need how we bring those organisations together across the city and how, you know, they're supported within the wards, but also how people are helped to support themselves by, you know, the community growing projects and other stuff that, you know, sort of people can take account of. And another point I think that's really, really important as well is going forward in how we actually operate our services. I know Tony spoke about a restructure. One of the most positive things around staff have to come in out of their own departments and do different work was the barriers that have been broken down within our own organisation. People actually understanding, you know, these may be people who've only ever exchanged emails. And I think sort of that's been really, really important to people understanding someone else's role. Actually, you know, we've had town hall staff working in the crematorium. You know, we've had different people doing very, very different jobs. And actually people saying, oh God, you're the one I was moaning about for my payments, you know, particularly when people were working on the food hub and they might have been working with people from finance or legal or wherever, when it was all hands on deck at the beginning. So I think the breaking down of those barriers, because one of the things we all want is to come out of those silos so we are more efficient. You know, we can actually scrutinise more clearly, you know, the efforts that are going on within our communities and use our money much more effectively to get much more value out of it. And I know some of the things that, you know, were said earlier by Tricia, that by us doing that, it also encourages other organisations, be they public bodies, charities, you know, or even private donations to contribute to that community going forward. So I think that's important too.
I think obviously where perhaps officers may have a different view is my next question, and I'd be really interested in what elected members think about this. Page 370 refers to the role of 6 primary decision-making groups with specified terms of reference. Now, I think what's clear is elected members from an operational perspective have been really engaged in the COVID response. I do wonder, is there more room for elected members to be involved in the strategic response? I wonder how the 6 primary decision-making groups interface with the Cabinet, with elected members, and also how they report to select committees. Is there potentially room for improvement on that? And I'm really interested in elected members' views as well.
Do you want to take the views first, Leon, or do you want us to respond just on that open question? I think there's always room for improvement. I think we did get weekly updates as a Cabinet from those groups, and I know certainly across the summer we were trying to get as much information out to elected members, you know, sort of certainly from Democratic Services, putting out weekly bulletins, daily bulletins, quite often in relation to COVID response. But I think there's always room for improvement, and I don't know if we were as effective as the information coming up, if you know, in having that sort of forum, in a sense of, you know, who was collating the information from councillors to feed into that. Obviously, a lot of councillors were doing that individually. You know, some may have been going through cabinet members, but I think certainly going forward, when we look at our neighbourhood approach, the approach we want to take is from that ground up, and the ones who are on the ground and know their communities well, you know, are the local ward councillors. So it is important, you know, that information is two-way. Whether or not they need to sit on the groups, you know, and I don't mind. It may not be, if the information is being shared, that people want to do that, but I think certainly it's open to be looked at going forward in relation to that.
Chair, I'm really happy to give a view here, and I've already set out before the need to take decisions at a more local level, and that absolutely includes local members being, you know, an active part of what happens in the wards. And I'm absolutely clear that in normal times, these decisions will be taken in direct consultation with members or taken by members at cabinet, etc. And that is absolutely the way the council works. But there's a really big but here, and I'm going to be completely frank with you. When you're dealing with a set of emergency scenarios like we were dealing with, we had to, in the first 4 days of lockdown, we mobilised 4,500 staff to be working from home. We set up food distribution arrangements. We had to engage with all of our Merseyside Resilience Forum partners, all the other local authorities, the blue light services, secondary responders, etc., and put an emergency response plan in place. These are the sorts of things that these groups were set up to do. And we were informing about the decisions we were taking, but that required, even within the council, and some of my senior colleagues were a bit shocked that I was being extremely directive in the meetings I was chairing, and I was making decisions and telling people what to do. And I think that was a bit of a culture shock to people, but this was to get things going in the first instance. And then gradually, as the rhythm of the way the council worked responded, we were able to delegate more to different groups to make things happen. And I was able to be less directive. And as we did that, we transitioned the way we were making decisions. And obviously things like we got virtual cabinet set up and virtual planning meetings that Councillor O'Brien continues to chair, and a range of things like that. But we had to keep, we were making life and death decisions, and we had to keep the city moving. We had to keep the council moving. We had to do that in extraordinarily challenging circumstances, quite often only with limited information, and we just had to make decisions. So this was not the normal way the council works, that you would want it to work or I would want it to work. But and it's not me being defensive at all, but the decision I took, and I discussed it with the mayor at the time, is that we are going to have to be extremely directive to keep everything focused, to get these things done. And then as soon as we've got the things in place, we'll start easing back on that situation. I'll be honest with you, I haven't been through a bigger leadership learning experience in my life. And I think that applies to a lot of us. And hopefully a lot of that, the things that went well, the things that didn't go as well, we can learn from. Mel put in the chat that we've got a lessons learned team up and running to make sure we capture every bit of learning, but that'll stand us in good stead going forwards. Our normal mode of operation is you're all completely familiar with, and I'm absolutely wedded to that. But in these extreme circumstances, I think we had no choice but to work in the way that we did. And I'm perfectly happy to be challenged about that. And whether we got the timing right of how we eased back into other forms of working, it was about how quickly we could get virtual meetings up and running and all sorts of other things. I think overall, whilst we did get some things wrong and we learned a lot of lessons, I think we did pretty well overall. I would say that, mind, wouldn't I?
Any comments?
On that particular point?
Shall I go out of the room?
We could do better, like on your report, couldn't we?
I suppose one of the points to make on to the members is a lot of these still follow the same route. Key decisions, you've got 44 in the pack. Some of them went through the virtual camera member meetings, as well as Tony taking them. So all the members were furnished with copies of those decisions. And then there's about another 160 or 70 even in the papers today, which are around operational decisions. So in some ways, I'm not saying members will engage fully, but they were cited on some of the decisions, certainly the key ones that were getting taken during the period.
And I think from an elected member point of view, all of the comments that were coming via the community on issues, be that, sort of people weren't getting food delivered or, sort of services that should have gone in, didn't, all of them were being fed back through those chains. But I know the point was around should elected members have been on those boards, the honest answer is I don't know whether they'd be better served on those boards or better served doing the work within the community and highlighting what those issues are. But I think that's a debate for us to have when we know, the purpose of that. And, certainly if people felt there needed to be more dialect, with people, around dialogue with people around what was happening and when, then, certainly feed that in. But I think, as Tony said, a lot was done on that emergency basis. And going forward, if we're going to have, sort of community type stuff, we need to look at what will be those decision-making bodies if we're doing things cross-portfolio as well, and how local councillors feed into that going forward. But again, that should be part of our governance and scrutiny function, and we need to build it into that.
I think some really, really vital points, and I don't think anyone for a moment would underestimate or underrate the response of the council or the need for agency of speed at what was, I think, as we'd all agree, an unprecedented crisis. So I think it's a talking point, really, isn't it? And I think it's probably one we might revisit going forward, and potentially whether it would be appropriate to have a COVID recovery select committee or scrutiny committee. I don't know. It's certainly something to perhaps consider. I don't know. Councillor Corbett.
Thanks, Chair. I think that the way the officers worked right across the piece, and as Wendy said before, the silos were crashed, and Tony said that was really important. At one point, we were having with the Poverty Action Group members, we were having a daily meeting on food, and we had a direct link into public health. So I'd like to thank those guys as well. And then we had all the various people around the table, and then we did it every 2 days, and then we did it and we basically got it, and then it linked up with the food hub. When that's set up, we had links in with LCVS on their side that they were coming in. I think where it went slightly wrong was where there wasn't then the connection with the new one that was set up, but that's fine. It happens, and we can look back on that. But it didn't quite go wrong. It was just that it could have tied up slightly tighter. The other issue was in terms of the networks. I think we've got a much more stronger food network going on. So we're linked up properly with what's considered the local food alliance, which is actually feeding Liverpool. It's the only one in the city at the moment. And we're building up that network of pantries and food projects and food banks and the different layers. We fed back into the National Food Strategy, as you know, Wendy, back in the December the previous year. So we had some idea about that. But I think, again, that having networks together where, as well as having local members and local councillors, you get those small groups and those slightly larger groups talking together in the forums that we have a direct conversation with as well. So you're keeping me on the street bit. And the final one to say is that in terms of the staff moving around, in Martin Younger's team, he pulled in a lot of people who were willing to move places to respond to the LCSS demands. And at one point, I remember very early on in the pandemic, we were up to, in one of the months, we were up to 200% increase in requests going through LCSS. And I remember, because Everton, obviously being the most disadvantaged ward, is one of the ones where people, and they know about it because we've got the word out, we've had the posters, etc. But actually what was happening was a lot of people were staying up till very, very late, filing, pushing through all the referrals. They were getting picked up at the other end. They were getting turned around incredibly quickly, but still with all the procedures in place. So I think that learning in terms of how you the pace of the change, but also the energy levels of the staff. That's what I'm really worried about, because once this starts to come down, the backfill in terms of the emotional side of it, the stresses and the strains on the families, on the people themselves, on their housing situations, you know, it'd be really good to have a look at that within that whole pandemic sort of review. Thanks.
Yeah, it raises an important point, and I'm sure Wendy and Tony will be keen to talk about it, about what plans are in place for staff at an incredibly challenging time on a number of fronts.
Shall I just pick that up briefly? I know Chris wants to come in on another point, but just to say, we've got mental health champions in every area of the council, and we've done a lot of communication with the staff, and we've got plans in place. We're working with other partners, because we're absolutely clear that for a lot of staff, and this goes right across the city, the mental health challenges of this will last way beyond the actual pandemic itself. And that sense of well-being and making sure we look after our colleagues and each other through this, and empowering people to go and ask their colleagues if they're okay, if they're struggling, just checking out is really, really important. And I do a regular video clip to staff, and I've probably picked up this issue half a dozen times on this, and there's been a whole host of other communication and engagement around it, and well-being plans being put in place. Obviously, we're learning all the time, but we're taking this incredibly seriously. And I know from the work we do with Merseycare and others, there are issues coming forward to us to support development of new units for acute mental health in the city, because the scale of the challenge has grown exponentially as a result of the pandemic. And as I said, the mental health challenges will last well beyond the pandemic itself, and we have to be absolutely cognizant of that.
I think another issue, Leon, is certainly, you know, sort of with the increase of people working at home, and that divide between work-life balance has become really, really blurred. And certainly, you know, because we've had a situation where we've been in lockdown, and so there's not a lot of opportunity for social activity other than perhaps people doing that daily walk or whatever they're doing, that people increasingly, even without being asked, are working longer hours. They've not been taking annual leave. You know, they've certainly not been taking a break quite often at weekends, and particularly during those busy periods. So, you know, when you're coming into work at times, when you know, for essential, you know, you can actually see people do look physically exhausted, particularly our staff who've been working round the clock, some of the staff we've mentioned tonight. And I think there is another issue as well as mental health, in like people haven't been able to have that recovery time and that switch off from work to let their bodies physically recover as well. Because, you know, if your computer's at home, you know, and you're worried about something, then you're going to go on and work, you know, for most people. Whereas you can, if you're, you know, generally in the office or wherever your location is, you can make that informed choice, right? I'm not taking my laptop home tonight, or this weekend I'm going to have a break. But when you're spending that time at home, and I think sort of that social isolation and actually not being around people, not just for your mental health, there's going to have to be a lot of reintroduction to people within the workplace. And actually for some people, the working at home has been a real bonus for them, where they've had caring responsibilities, or even some people who've got health or disability issues who found working at home much more advantage to them in those respects, and may struggle coming back to the workplace on a full-time basis. So I think working with our trade unions, we've got a lot of work to do about actually what our workforce will look like in respect of where they're based. And I know we've constantly got an accommodation strategy, and I think some of those things need to be built in that as well, because it's not always about, you know, services for mental health. It's about how people adjust. You know, people aren't used to going out very much because we've had this lockdown as well during a winter period. The first bit was great. We had that, you know, end of March, April, beginning of May last year, where the weather was fantastic, people really enjoying it. As the time's gone on, people have felt actually quite trapped in the home, and they just, you know, councillors as well as our employees just feel they're constantly working all of the time, and it'll be actually breaking that routine as well for people. I think going forward that we need to actually build in to that working week for people. So I think that's an important thing for us all to keep an eye on.
Thanks, Wendy. I think, you know, from your comments and some of the early comments about the consultation, the budget, the one-stop shops, I think what's really evident as a local authority is a commitment to our people and a recognition that our strength is our people in terms of our workforce. And I think that should really be highlighted. And I think that is really, really welcome to see it so made so manifestly obvious. And I think we really all welcome those remarks about the support for our staff. I know. Sorry, Chris, do you want to come in?
Yeah, can I just suggest something? As the report says, and Mel mentioned there's like a lessons learned exercise going on, but also the audit team had sessions with all the directors around impact assessments of COVID. I think it might be useful on the governance one. We just do something around members. Like, you know, and it can even be, you know, a questionnaire, because we've got a really good response to the Barnes one, Mike done, around, you know, how was communication with local members? What was the issues you were faced with? How did you respond? So we get some members' feedback as part of that as well, into that sort of element on governance. You know, how did it operate? What do you think was the issues? Was it at certain times? Did it get better? So, and that can be done, as I say, as even just a simple questionnaire which members can respond to. So I'll build that into the audit plan for those areas next year.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, I think we are there with this. I just want to cast my eye again to see if there are any further indications for questions. Okay, with that, can I thank members for the questions? Can I thank officers and Wendy for the responses? There's some great detail there and some real talking points. Can I therefore move then that the information set out in the report be noted? Additionally, a further report to this committee on continued COVID decision making within the next 6 months. And that the audit work that is also outlined in relation to COVID being incorporated within the committee's scrutiny work programme for the next 12 months. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Okay. Can I direct members' attention to items number 7 and 8, use of scheme of delegation and best value inspection review by statutory officers group? Can I propose to take the two report items together as they both provide the same clear information on decisions made under the scheme of delegation? Can I therefore invite the acting mayor to introduce both reports? Wendy.
Thanks, Leon. These reports are here to provide information on the decisions taken under delegated powers for 11th of December 2020 to the 1st of February 2021, within those areas subject to the government's best value inspection, and as well as providing...
Unknown participant is now exiting.
Bye, whoever you are, as well as providing our regular scheduled list of delegated decisions, which is regularly reported to this committee.
Okay. Are there any questions from members on this? Councillor Makinson.
Thank you, Chair. Just in light of the current environment, it would be helpful if we knew what additional oversight there'd been on the land and property disposals, either by the inspection team or internal audit or anyone else, and also if any of the purchasers were offshore companies.
Andrew, could you just repeat the beginning of that question, because somebody entering or leaving the meeting, sort of the device came across you, so missed the first bit, sorry.
Yes, I was just asking what additional oversight there'd been over the land and property disposals, just to provide assurances for the wider community, never mind councillors, of the way they were handled.
Are you talking about future or?
No, the actual disposals that are on.
The one that are on the agenda, sorry, yeah.
So all the disposals have been through the due diligence group, and we have made sure there's been appropriate due diligence put in place. On top of that, as an extra robust measure, each of the disposals reports do now go before the statutory officers group for full scrutiny by the statutory officers before the delegated authority is taken as being approved.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Andrew. Does that clarify it fully?
That is helpful, yes. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thanks, Mel. Okay. If there are no further questions from members, I move that we note both reports. Is that agreed? Okay. Now, I do want to draw members' attention to agenda item 9, an additional agenda item, and this relates to the Invest to Earn report that was circulated, I believe, earlier today, shortly before the meeting. Now, what I do propose is that we return to scrutinise this in the March meeting, which I think would certainly be welcome. And certainly when we think about quality scrutiny, it requires some time spent looking at the report. Are members amenable to that in the first instance? Okay, but what I would like to do, even though it is for information purposes at present, if I could just invite Tony to perhaps talk about future plans for Invest to Earn and how he thinks we could potentially improve scrutiny of it.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Clearly, Invest to Earn has been a really key part of the council's budget strategy, financial strategy over the last few years, obviously with significant reductions in central government funding, and some of those investments, and I could pick out things like Finch Farm, the Cunard building, etc., have either saved the council significant sums of money or generated really good returns on investment. There's a range of others as well. It's really important that we continue to make sure that our investments work for us, and that there's proper governance around those investments. I haven't got the specific plans in front of me now because I wasn't anticipating the question, but there are proposals to set up an investment board that formally manages those investments, records all of the decisions that are taken, and makes sure that those are open to appropriate scrutiny as we go through that, both by Cabinet and this sort of committee, this sort of group as well. I'm sure at the March meeting we can go into a bit more detail, but we're absolutely clear as officers the need for transparency, for strong governance and accountability around the decisions, and not just the decisions to acquire an asset, but the management of those assets on an ongoing basis as well. And that includes divesting ourselves of those assets at the appropriate time when they're not meeting our investment requirements. I think all of those, I don't know whether Mel wants to come in, because she probably knows a bit more about this than I do, and it's not a hospital pass, I promise you, but those are the sorts of things we're putting in place to better regulate those investment issues so that people can be really clear about this, and the role that members play in scrutinising that is going to be very important going forwards. Anything to add, Mel?
The Capital Board and the process that is set out in the Capital Strategy papers reflects what Tony has said. So going forward, the Invest to Earn initiatives, the majority will require some capital funding if we go into any other schemes or projects, and they will be subject to that Capital Strategy Board scrutiny. Which will involve an outline business case, a full business case, and then potentially some gateway reviews as we go through the investment. The Cunard building that Tony mentioned is not included in Invest to Earn because that was an Invest to Save and was the start of the accommodation strategy. So for March, if you would like, Chair, I'm quite happy to bring an update on the accommodation strategy back. That involves moving staff from other city centre buildings into the Cunard as well. So I'm more than happy to bring an update back on that scheme in particular. But as Tony suggested, we'll be scrutinising each of these as part of that Capital Board, and we'll be scrutinising whether we think we should continue to hold some of these investments going forward. The other aspect of that is we are planning to expand the subsidiary company element of the monitoring report in due course to include the investments as well that we hold.
I think, just as a brief comment, and I really appreciate those commitments I think there's maybe a little bit of an expectation gap as to what investor earn actually is. Some people might see it as just equity investments. Some people realise it's strategic projects as well. It's also investor save. What can we do to perhaps clarify what investor earn actually is, and so our residents and stakeholders understand it? Do you think that is a bit of an issue potentially?
I think with all of the business that we undertake as a council, I think it's really important our communication is really clear. You know, we're looking at a member development programme, and I know Tony is keen post, you know, lockdown requirements to do more interactive community type engagement things, so where people can, you know, sort of meet the council, you know, sort of within their communities, and you know, we can talk about some of these issues and what they are. But I think actually making that clear about what those things are and what some of those investments bring, because as you say, some of them may not have a direct financial gain to the council. You know, to take the Arena and Convention Centre, but what that has brought to the city in driving forward the economy of the city in relation to that growth in hotels, growth in small businesses, you know, sort of growth in that hospitality and tourism sector, which in turn does bring us a return through business tax, you know, and council tax if people want to live here or study here, etc. So I suppose it's looking at some of those things in that wider context, that some things you can see, you know, if you like, I was going to go back to old money then, saying pounds, shillings and pence, but probably in pounds, you know, showing me age now, but sometimes people is just saying, you know, we can't see where you've got, but it is looking at that broader sense of economic drivers and social drivers as well, because sometimes we invest in things to bring about a better social outcome, you know, within our communities as well. So if you take it, like if we were saying about the community bank before, in a sense, you know, that may overall have benefits long term. So again, it's when we look at our financial plan, our medium-term financial plan and other things, it's about sort of what we're invested in and the purpose of that as well. So I think both for elected members and from the community, information sessions are really, really important, and getting those down in very simplified sort of language that is easy for people then to, you know, if they're having discussions, you know, whether in their communities, within their own political groups, within the wider community, they can actually, you know, speak about it themselves with some confidence and some clarity about what that means.
And just to add to that, I completely agree with what Wendy's saying there, Chair. And I think the need for us to demonstrate transparency on the decisions we're making, why we're making them, and the impact of those decisions in terms of reporting back on the investments, whether it's social investment, commercial investment, investment for regeneration purposes, etc. I think that's something we can definitely improve on. And we'll pick this up and come up with some proposals to discuss with Wendy, and in due course come back to you as a committee on it.
Now, I am mindful, and thank you both for those comments, and I think it's important, as Wendy's alluded to, there is a wider value, but actually thinking how we can try and capture that. But that is really welcome, and I think going forward, I think it'll be really valued. Now, I know this is an information purposes for the time being, but Andrew looks extraordinarily keen to deal with it. So I would like to ask Andrew.
Actually, Chair, I had forgotten to put my hand down for the previous question. Now you've put me in.
Extremely keen for his tea.
I'll just say that it's very positive what's being proposed here. It would go a long way to addressing many of the concerns I've been raising in this committee for the past 5 years. So I'm very happy with what I'm hearing so far. There has been a lack of clarity in how investments have been chosen, and as any economist would tell you, the opportunity cost of picking one set of investment is that you're perhaps missing out on something else that might be better. And we've never had that clarity before over how individual things were picked. So I'll just leave it there, and I look forward to seeing the report in detail.
Thanks, Andrew.
Chair, just to intervene briefly before your closing remarks, just to draw to your attention and indeed to the wider membership of the committee, as members will be aware, there was no scheduled question time included on the published agenda, reflecting the scale of reports to be dealt with and reviewed by yourselves this evening. However, we are in receipt of a number of written questions from fellow member colleagues in the form of Councillor Tom Logan and Councillor Steve Radford. The questions submitted do not relate to the published items on the agenda. Therefore, with your agreement, the questions, together with the accompanying responses, will be circulated to members of the committee alongside these minutes when published, and obviously submitted to your next formal meeting. Thank you.
So just to be clear, Mike, those questions and responses will be incorporated on the next minutes?
Within the minutes of this meeting, Chair, and obviously they'll also go for your review at your next meeting as well.
Yeah. I think that's entirely fair and reasonable.
Thank you.
Well, I think at this point, and it did dovetail nicely, because Andrew began the meeting by saying he was glad to hear my voice, and I'm going to say I agree with Andrew. So two things perhaps we thought we'd never hear. So that's a kind of happy coincidence, if you will. So thank you, everyone. I think that concludes today's items of business. I think, again, thank you for everybody's questions. Thanks to members of the committee for your constructive engagement. Thanks to Wendy. Thank you to all that have viewed this evening's proceedings online. And the meeting is now concluded. Thank you very much, everyone, and keep safe. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Chair.
And thank you, Chair.